the video overview of the book of 3rd John. Now, the book of 3rd John, as the title suggests, is the third epistle written by the Apostle John. And John we know as one of Jesus' closest disciples and friends during Jesus' ministry. John is an eyewitness of Jesus' life and ministry. As he describes in the Gospel of John, we see him describing Jesus' ministry and really who Jesus is for us. But he also writes epistles, and we find his loving care for God's church in the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as well as the book of Revelation. And all of John's books carry really similar themes, because they're all about Jesus. He wants us to draw our attention and our hope to Jesus himself. And these truths are found in his epistles of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And they're really written by the Apostle John with this clear love for the church. So as you're reading what he's saying, you're going to discover that John distills almost everything that he recorded in the Gospel of John, chapters 13 through 16, down into these short letters. And in John 13 through 16 is known as Jesus' upper room discourse. These are Jesus' final words to his disciples before his death. And John, having been a member of that group in that room, recognizes the importance of what Jesus has said to his disciples for the church. So he writes these letters to help them understand and to apply the truth to their daily lives. John reminds them of the truth, of the hope, and of the love that they have in Christ. We find that in 3rd John as well. John begins this short letter by saying, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth." And if you're a parent, you can likely relate to this statement. John views the church as his beloved children in the faith. His desire is to see them grow and remain faithful to the truth that they've been taught. Well, you might notice that John does not call himself by his name in this book, but rather as the elder. John does this in all of his books, most notably in the Gospel of John, where we find him not as John the disciple, but as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Here he describes himself as elder. This term can refer to both his position in the church as the apostle, the pastor, and also to his age, as he's likely very old as he pens this letter. Well, what is 3rd John about? Well, John's main idea in this letter is to encourage his friends to faithful generosity and love for the truth. You can outline this book based on 3 specific names that he uses. So you'll find him talking about 3 specific people that he calls by name. One is named Gaius, and then the other 2 he addresses as Diotrephes and Demetrius. Let's look at each one briefly and how he talks to each one. First, John commends Gaius for his faithful support to the church and gospel ministry. This is who the letter is written to. Gaius has partnered with the gospel work of missions, and his support has greatly encouraged John. He says, "We ought to support people like these, that they may be fellow workers in the truth," in verse 8. There's no question for God's family, for the church, whether they are to be involved in mission work or not. So the question for you is not, am I called to missions? But rather, how has God called me to be involved in this work? And Gaius serves as a great example here, how he's partnered with them to support their needs so that they could continue the gospel work. So that's Gaius in verses 1 through 8. Second, John condemns Diotrephes, who opposes the work of the church in verses 9 through 11. Gaius is contrasted by this man named Diotrephes. Instead of partaking in the work of the church, Diotrephes is opposed to it. John says he's self-centered. He refuses to recognize the authority of the apostles. He's causing division. He's not welcoming true believers as family, but instead he seeks to drive people out of the church. Paul refers to Diotrephes and what he's doing here as evil in verse 11. The church is called to imitate good and not evil. And so this is how you can discern who is a part of God's family and who is not. It's the love that they have for each other. Diotrephes does not exhibit that love, and so he's condemned in verses 9 through 11. Well, the third person that John references is Demetrius. John compliments Demetrius for his faithfulness and his testimony to the church. And John mentions Demetrius here as a figure, an example of someone who does good, which is the opposite of Diotrephes, who is doing evil. Demetrius has a good testimony in the church, and people speak highly of him. John adds his recommendation here and says that he's doing good, and he compliments him and commends him on his way to Gaius. Now, it will be impossible for you to be involved in your church in the proper way if your testimony is that of unfaithfulness, or if you're seeking to undermine truth to elevate yourself. I mean, we see that exemplified here in Diotrephes and Demetrius. One gets condemned, one is complimented. Well, in John's conclusion, in the last couple of verses, John leaves us with a friendly salutation. And here we see that the friendship of believers is evident. He says, "Greet them all by name." And his hope is to visit them soon. John would much rather have this conversation with Gaius in person to share in the joy and fellowship of the church. And he's hoping to do that really soon. And that's 3 John. I hope that you'll be encouraged by the simple truth found here toward faithfulness and generosity and love for the truth.